Mr. Briggs, I've reviewed your file personally. Carolyn Hess spoke with the practiced patience of someone who had explained the same thing to countless people who didn't understand it. The billing codes on your account are accurate. The insurance company made its determination based on those codes. There is nothing here for us to correct. Darnell Briggs sat across from her with a 40-page hospital bill spread across the table and a notepad in his hand. He had been taking notes since she began speaking. I've read the bill, he said. I have some questions about the third procedure code. Hess glanced at the notepad, then back at him. Those codes are standard. Darnell wrote something down. She would later say she didn't know what he was writing. That was the part that should have concerned her, not what he was writing. The fact that he was writing at all. Carolyn Hess ran the billing department of Meridian Medical Center with the efficiency of someone who had never been seriously questioned. She had a system. When patients disputed their bills, the calls followed a predictable pattern. Confusion, frustration, and eventually reluctant acceptance. She had no reason to believe this would be different. The man across from her was a truck driver with a $400,000 hospital bill and no legal background. He had brought a notepad, which most people didn't. But a notepad wasn't a threat. What she didn't know was how long he'd been reading that bill, and what someone who reads contracts for a living finds when he reads one twice. What does a billing system look like when someone finally refuses to stop asking questions about a single line item? If that question is already pulling at you, subscribe now. The answer is more satisfying than you'd expect. Darnell Briggs had been driving long-haul trucks for 11 years, and the job had taught him one thing that had nothing to do with driving. Read everything before you sign it. Then read it again. A freight contract with a loose liability clause could leave him responsible for damaged cargo worth more than his truck. A logbook with the wrong hours could cost him his commercial license. A vehicle inspection form with one missed item could get him pulled off the road 3 states from home. He had learned all of that the slow way, through small and expensive mistakes during his first 2 years. He had never made the same mistake twice. He read every document he was given, every line before putting his name on anything. Not because he distrusted people, but because he had learned that errors didn't need bad intentions to cause damage. His 14-year-old son, Evan, lived with him on weekends and for half the school week. The arrangement had worked for 3 years, and together they had built a quiet household with its own logic. Evan did his homework at the kitchen table, while Darnell prepared for his next run or reviewed paperwork. They talked about what needed talking about and left the rest alone. Evan was practical in the way children become practical when they've watched a parent handle everything without complaining. He didn't ask questions he didn't need answered. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Another driver ran a red light and hit Darnell's cab on the passenger side. By the time paramedics arrived, Darnell had 3 broken ribs, severe chest trauma, and a lung that needed to be drained before it collapsed completely. He spent 14 days at Meridian Medical Center, 6 in intensive care, and the rest on a monitored floor where machines beeped in steady rhythms. He eventually learned to recognize those sounds the way he recognized traffic. He didn't have a choice about being there. The alternative was not being anywhere. His insurance came through the trucking company's benefits program, contracted with a carrier called HealthBridge. The policy described it as comprehensive coverage for employees and dependents. Darnell had not read those documents as carefully as he read freight contracts. He would later recognize that as the first mistake in a sequence that cost him nearly 2 years. The bill from Meridian Medical Center arrived 3 weeks after he was discharged for $112,000. He read the number several times before accepting that it actually said what it said. The bill gave him 90 days before the hospital would send the account to collections. If the collection account appeared on his credit report, it could affect his ability to renew his commercial driving license. He was on day 45 when he walked into the meeting with Carolyn Hess. It was the 17th call or visit he had made in 8 weeks. And for the first time, he understood that arguing from confusion was not going to produce a result. 3 days after the meeting, he spread all 40 pages across the kitchen table after Evan went to sleep. Then he began at the beginning. He was doing what he did with freight contracts, looking for the place where the numbers didn't match, where the description didn't fit what he remembered, where something had been written down differently from how it had actually happened. The system he needed to understand worked like this. Medical billing in the United States used CPT codes, standardized numerical codes, in which each number represented a specific medical procedure. Insurance companies did not evaluate everything that had actually happened to a patient. They evaluated the code submitted in the billing record. If a code was wrong, the insurer could deny the claim based on what the record said, regardless of whether the treatment had been necessary, appropriate, and correctly performed. That was the mechanism. It wasn't a secret. It was simply how the system worked. And most people who went through it never looked closely enough to see the gap between the code and the reality it was supposed to represent. Darnell read through the itemized charges and matched each one against a denial letter from HealthBridge. The insurance company had identified 3 procedure codes as a basis for denying the claim, 3 treatments it characterized as medically unnecessary. He looked up all 3 codes on his phone. The first was a chest drainage procedure. He remembered that clearly. A doctor had explained it to him before performing it. The second was intensive respiratory monitoring. He remembered the equipment beside his bed and nurses checking the readings every hour. The third code he read twice. He couldn't place it. The next morning, he called Meridian's billing department and asked what the third code referred to. The representative explained that it was a standard supplemental procedure typically included with the type of surgery he had undergone. Darnell asked whether the procedure had actually been performed on him. The representative said it was a standard code for that type of case. Darnell sat with that answer, not whether the procedure had been performed, whether it was a standard code for the case. Those were different statements, and the representative had answered only one of them. Was the procedure actually performed? Darnell asked, or was the code applied automatically based on the category of surgery? The representative said the code reflected the hospital's standard billing practice for that type of procedure. Darnell wrote in his notebook, third CPT code. Representative could not confirm procedure was performed. Said it was standard practice for the case type. He underlined the last 4 words. Then he read the HealthBridge denial letter again. The company had denied the entire claim, not just the third procedure, the full $412,000. The reason was that the third code fell into a category their policy defined as experimental treatment, not covered under his plan. One code that might not have described any actual procedure had triggered a blanket denial of every charge on the bill. Evan came home from school the following afternoon and found his father at the kitchen table with the pages spread out and the notepad beside them. He looked over Darnell's shoulder. "What are you looking for?" Darnell didn't look up. "Well, the numbers don't match." Evan nodded and went to put down his backpack. When he returned, he asked another question. "Did the hospital get something wrong?" "Maybe," Darnell said. "I hope they'll fix it." Evan thought about that. What if they don't want to fix it? Darnell didn't answer immediately. He thought about the question longer than the conversation required. Before he could make any useful argument, he needed to understand what the third code actually described and whether it had any basis in his medical record. He called Dr. Emily Webb, the surgeon whose name appeared on his discharge paperwork. He explained what he had found and asked whether she could review his file. She called back 2 days later. The third procedure code did not correspond to any procedure she had performed or ordered for him. She would put that in writing. Darnell thanked her and asked whether she would also confirm that his treatment had been medically necessary. She said she would. Both letters arrived within the week. Darnell thanked her and asked whether she would also confirm that his treatment had been medically necessary. She said she would. Both letters arrived within the week. He called Meridian's billing director, Carolyn Hess, with both letters in hand, and asked to have the third code corrected. Hess said the code reflected the hospital's internal billing guidelines and was accurate according to their standards. Darnell kept his voice calm. "A doctor is telling you the code doesn't describe anything she actually did." Hess said the medical department had reviewed the record and confirmed the coding. "Can I speak with whoever did the review?" "That isn't within the scope of the billing department." Darnell then called HealthBridge and told claims manager Frank Dalton about the doctor's letter. Dalton told him the denial decision was based on the codes in the billing record, not on post-discharge physician statements. If the codes were incorrect, the hospital would need to issue a corrected claim before HealthBridge could reconsider. Darnell explained that the hospital was refusing to correct the codes. Dalton said that was a matter between the patient and the hospital. Darnell was back where he had started, except now he understood the loop more precisely. The hospital had a code in his record that didn't describe anything real. The insurance company had denied his claim based on that code. The hospital wouldn't fix the code because fixing it would require acknowledging that it had been placed there without clinical basis. The insurance company wouldn't help because its role was to evaluate codes, not question whether the codes were accurate. The loop was closed, and it was designed to stay that way. A week after his call with Dalton, Meridian sent him a written response to his correction request. The CPT code reflected the hospital's billing practice in accordance with internal guidelines, and they were unable to modify records that had already been processed. The phrase Darnell kept returning to was internal guidelines, not medical record, not clinical documentation, not physician order. Internal guidelines. He had a name in his notebook, Rachel Grant, a lawyer who handled billing disputes and insurance claims. A colleague at the freight yard had given him her name 2 years earlier. Darnell had written down weeks ago, but hadn't called. He had learned from 11 years of freight work that walking into a conversation with someone who knew more than you was most effective when you arrived with something useful to say. Now, he had something useful to say. That evening, Evan found him at the kitchen table again. Was the code something they added just for you? Evan asked. Or something they added for a lot of people? Darnell looked at him. Then he looked back at the notepad. The next morning, he called Rachel Grant. Rachel's first move was to ask for the internal guidelines Meridian kept citing. She sent a formal written request to the hospital's legal department, quoting the language from Hess's letter and requesting documentation of the guidelines as they applied to the CPT code in question. Meridian's legal response arrived 9 days later. The hospital's billing system was proprietary operational software and did not fall within public disclosure requirements. The auto-assignment process reflected standard industry practice. The hospital maintained that its coding was accurate and retained the right to pursue the outstanding balance through collection channels. Rachel read the response to Darnell over the phone. Then she pointed out 2 things. First, the phrase auto-assignment had never appeared in any previous communication. It confirmed in writing that the code had been applied by software rather than by a human making a clinical determination. Second, the phrase standard industry practice had replaced accurate clinical coding. Rachel found that change in language more revealing than the hospital had probably intended. Darnell wrote both observations in his notebook. The next step was a records request. Under federal patient privacy law, Darnell had the right to access his complete designated record set from Meridian, not merely a summary, but the records related to his care and the financial processing connected to it. Rachel drafted the request to include the billing audit log, the internal records showing how and when each code had been assigned. Meridian provided his clinical records within 2 weeks. The billing audit log, they said, was internal operational documentation and not part of the patient's designated record set. Rachel filed a formal follow-up, citing the regulatory language defining what the designated record set must include. What the hospital sent in response was not the full audit log, but it wasn't nothing. It was the standard billing data associated with his account, the information Meridian was obligated to provide under the basic privacy framework. The audit log itself remained withheld. Rachel knew how to read the partial record, and there, in a field Darnell had never seen before, was the third CPT code, the code that had no corresponding procedure in his clinical file, the code that had triggered the full denial from HealthBridge. In the field labeled source, it read, auto-assigned, not entered by a billing coder, not ordered by a physician, auto-assigned. Darnell was studying the record at the kitchen table when Evan came home. He dropped his bag by the door, walked over, and looked at the page. What does auto-assign mean? Darnell told him the computer had added the code automatically. Evan looked at the page. Did it add it just for you? Darnell didn't answer. Evan continued. Or for a lot of people? Darnell looked at his son, then back at the record. Then he put the page down and called Rachel. The data from the state hospital monitoring program took 2 weeks to arrive. Rachel had access to the database through her registration as a legal practitioner in the program, a compliant initiative for hospitals receiving Medicare and Medicaid funding that required them to submit aggregated billing data on procedure codes and payment outcomes. The data included procedure codes, claims submitted, claims paid or denied, and insurer categories. It was a kind of data that looked like nothing until you knew what to search for. The pattern was not subtle once they found it. The third CPT code appeared in 92% of cases at Meridian, matching Darnell's surgery type, when the patient had employer-sponsored insurance from a small or mid-sized company. The same code appeared in just 17% of cases when the patient carried premium coverage through a large employer plan. Same surgical procedure, same hospital, same surgeons. The variable was the insurance category, and HealthBridge had a 100% denial rate for that code. Every claim from Meridian containing it had been denied. Every one. Meridian had repeatedly submitted the code to HealthBridge knowing it would be denied, and then billed the patients directly for the balance. Rachel laid out the documents when Darnell came to her office. She walked him through the numbers without editorializing. What the data shows, she said, is a pattern. And what doesn't it show? Intent. She told him she would contact her network of patient-side attorneys to find out whether anyone had seen the same pattern involving other Meridian patients. Because if it had happened to one person, the probability was that it had happened to others. Darnell drove home and called his brother, Caleb, that evening. He told Caleb everything. Caleb listened without interrupting. When Darnell finished, Caleb said, "If you're right, then this didn't happen only to you." "I know. Find someone else it happened to." Darnell thanked him, ended the call, and called Rachel back. He told her to move quickly with the attorney network. The following week brought 3 developments. The first was Meridian's escalation. Its legal department stated that the billing software was proprietary commercial property, that the auto-assignment process reflected standard industry practice, and that the hospital reserved the right to pursue the outstanding balance through legal action. They were no longer explaining. They were threatening. The second development was Frank Dalton's formal written denial of Darnell's internal appeal at HealthBridge. Dalton's letter stated that the claims determination had been made according to policy terms and based on procedure codes submitted in the billing record. If Darnell believed the codes were inaccurate, the appropriate remedy was to request a corrected claim from the treating facility. The denial was final at the internal review level. Darnell read the letter twice. Then he went to page 31 of his insurance policy documents. There, under appeals and dispute resolution, he found a provision he had never read before. He had the right to request an external independent review by the state insurance regulator after exhausting the internal appeal. He had to file within 60 days of the final internal denial. Dalton's letter was dated 2 days earlier. Darnell had 58 days. The third development was a call from Rachel. A lawyer in her network had a client named Maria Reyes. 2 years earlier, Maria had undergone the same surgery at Meridian, carried HealthBridge insurance, received the same denial, and paid the balance out of pocket because she hadn't known there was another option. She still had all her paperwork. Her attorney had been unable to pursue the matter at the time because there wasn't enough statistical evidence to establish a pattern. With Darnell's data and Maria's documentation, they had something different. 2 instances, the same mechanism, 2 years apart, the same hospital, the same insurer. Rachel filed a request for external independent review with the state insurance department the following morning. The external review process required HealthBridge to provide its full claims determination record to an independent examiner, including documentation showing that a qualified medical professional had reviewed Darnell's clinical record before the denial was issued. That was the specific requirement, not whether the denial was technically correct under the policy language, whether it had been made through a legitimate review process involving actual clinical judgment. Rachel explained the significance to Darnell using terms he understood from freight work. A carrier can refuse a load for documented reasons, she said, but the refusal has to be supported by an actual inspection, not a software flag. You can't refuse a load you never examined and call it a legitimate determination. HealthBridge had denied his claim without a medical professional ever looking at his clinical file. Its system had read a billing code, matched it to a denial category, and generated an outcome without any human medical judgment being applied to whether his treatment had been necessary. If HealthBridge could not produce documentation showing that someone had actually reviewed his case, the denial was procedurally defective regardless of what the policy said about the code category. And critically, the required review had to occur before the denial was issued, not reconstructed afterward. The date on Dalton's denial letter was already in the record. When the state insurance department notified HealthBridge of the external review request, Frank Dalton, for the first time in the entire process, picked up Darnell Briggs's clinical record and actually read it, not the billing codes, the clinical file, the admission records, the surgeon's notes, Dr. Webb's documentation, the nursing records, the discharge summary. He was looking for documentation of a clinical review HealthBridge could present to the state examiner. What he found instead was a 14-day hospitalization record documenting every treatment administered to Darnell. and no mention of the procedure described by the third CPT code. No physician order, no nursing note, no procedure log entry. The code had been placed in the billing record by Meridian's auto-assignment system and had never been verified against the clinical file. Dalton called HealthBridge legal team. His goal at that point was not to help Darnell. It was to understand how exposed the company was before the state's independent examiner found the same thing. After reviewing the record, legal counsel gave him the answer: considerably exposed. For the first time since the denial letter arrived, the mechanism that had produced Darnell's situation was visible to someone with the authority to evaluate it, and that person had 30 days to explain it. The hearing before the State Department was held in a conference room on the 6th floor of a building that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet. It was not a courtroom. There was no jury, no formal rules of evidence. It was a structured administrative review, with both sides presenting documentation to a panel of 3 examiners empowered to require explanations, order corrective action, and impose financial penalties if state insurance regulations had been violated. Darnell sat beside Rachel at one end of the table. Carolyn Hess sat across from them with 2 people from Meridian's legal department. Frank Dalton sat farther along the same side with HealthBridge General Counsel. For the first time in months of phone calls and letters, everyone was in the same room. Rachel presented first. She placed the documents on the table in order: the original bill, the HealthBridge denial letter, the CPT code lookup showing what the third code described and what it didn't, Dr. Webb's written confirmation that no such procedure had been performed or ordered, the hospital's written response saying the code reflected internal guidelines, the partial billing record showing the code marked auto-assigned in the source field, and the statistical data from the state monitoring program. She laid each document down as she described it and let the examiners read what was in front of them. The statistical analysis received the most attention. A 92% application rate for the code in matching surgical cases when patients carried small or mid-size employer insurance. 17% for the same surgery type with premium large employer coverage. A 100% denial rate from HealthBridge for that code. The examiners read the numbers, then read them again. After Rachel finished, the lead examiner turned to HealthBridge counsel. Please provide the clinical review documentation for Darnell Briggs's claim. The record showing that a qualified medical professional reviewed his clinical file before the denial decision was issued. HealthBridge counsel said the company's review process was based on procedure codes submitted in the billing record. The examiner nodded. I understand that. I'm asking specifically for the clinical review documentation. Silence filled the room. HealthBridge counsel finally said there was no separate clinical review documentation because a determination had been generated through the company's automated claims processing system. The examiner wrote something on the document in front of her. Then she asked how the automated system had determined that Darnell's treatment was not medically necessary. The counsel said the system matched the submitted procedure codes against the policy's coverage categories. The examiner asked whether any medical professional at HealthBridge had evaluated whether the treatment Darnell received was appropriate for his condition. The counsel said the automated process was the standard review methodology. The examiner noted for the record that Section 47.3 of the State Insurance Code required adverse benefit determinations for medical treatment to include review by a qualified healthcare professional with expertise relevant to the condition at issue. She also noted that HealthBridge had not produced documentation showing that such a review had occurred before the denial was issued. The panel would address that finding in its determination. Frank Dalton sat at the table with his prepared materials in front of him. He did not open the folder. Rachel then introduced Maria Reyes' documentation through her attorney, who joined the hearing by phone. 2 years earlier, the same surgical category, the same hospital, the same insurer, the same code, the same denial, the same outcome. Maria had paid the balance. Her record showed the identical auto-assign notation in the same field, with no clinical record supporting the code. Rachel then presented a summary of 3 additional complaints the department had received over the previous 18 months involving Meridian and HealthBridge. Separate cases, each handled individually. Each closed after patients paid and removed their accounts from the active complaint system. Placed side by side in the proceeding, they became something different from 5 individual disputes. The lead examiner turned to Carolyn Hess. Explain the medical basis for the auto-assignment of the third code to Darnell Briggs's surgical category. Hess said it was standard billing practice. The examiner asked what clinical documentation governed that practice. Specifically, what medical authority had determined that the procedure described by the code was associated with that surgical category. Hess said the billing department would need to defer to legal counsel. The examiner stopped her. The question is about medical documentation, not legal interpretation. Is there anyone from Meridian who can speak to the clinical basis? Nobody at Meridian's end of the table answered. The examiner noted that the hospital had declined to provide a medical basis for the auto-assignment practice. The hearing lasted 2.5 hours. When it concluded, the panel chair said the department would issue written findings within 30 days. Then he added that, given the volume of documentation and the pattern identified, the department was opening a broader inquiry into the billing practices at Meridian Medical Center and the claims review processes at Healthbridge, separate from and in addition to Darnell's individual case. Darnell and Rachel walked toward the elevator after the room cleared. "What do you think?" he asked. Rachel looked back toward the conference room. "The panel asked the questions that needed to be asked," she said, "and the answers, or the lack of answers, are now part of the record." Meridian's counsel called Rachel's office 12 days after the hearing. The hospital was prepared to negotiate a resolution of Darnell Briggs's individual account. The negotiation took 3 weeks. Rachel handled it. The settlement eliminated the balance entirely. $412,000. Zeroed. Meridian also reimbursed his legal costs. The agreement did not include an admission of wrongdoing, which was standard language. Darnell read it and understood it without making anything of it. The state insurance department issued its findings on his individual case separately as an administrative record. Healthbridge claims determination had not met the requirement of Section 47.3 because no qualified medical professional had reviewed Darnell's clinical record before the denial was issued. The department ordered Healthbridge to conduct an independent clinical review of Darnell's claim using physician with relevant specialty expertise. That review confirmed that every aspect of his treatment had been medically necessary given his condition upon admission. The broader inquiry into Meridian and Healthbridge lasted 8 months. The findings showed that Healthbridge's auto-denial protocol for the code in question had been applied to more than 200 claims involving Meridian billings during the previous 18 months. In every case, there had been no independent clinical review. Most of those patients had paid and closed their accounts, removing themselves from the visible complaint system. That was why 3 earlier complaints had failed to reveal the scale of what was happening. The department ordered Healthbridge to revise its claims processing requirements to include qualified clinical review before adverse determinations were issued. The order was backed by financial penalties for noncompliance. Maria Reyes was notified by her attorney. When the broader settlement was finalized, her case was included. She received a full refund of the amount she had paid, plus statutory interest. Rachel called to confirm the payment had gone through. Maria asked if this meant she hadn't been wrong all along about what happened to her. Rachel told her she had not been wrong. Maria said, "Okay." That was all she said. What Carolyn Hess and Frank Dalton were individually accountable for was described in the administrative record with accuracy rather than drama. Hess had administered a billing system that auto-assigned a code with no clinical basis in a pattern that correlated with insurance category. She had defended that system in writing, in meetings, and in a regulatory hearing, calling it standard practice without producing medical documentation to support that characterization. She had not designed the software. She had inherited it, operated it, and protected it when questioned. Dalton had managed a claims process that denied more than 200 claims based on automated code matching without clinical review. In violation of state regulatory requirement, he was professionally responsible for knowing. He had not designed that process either. He had operated it and signed his name to its outputs. Neither faced criminal charges. The conduct documented in the administrative record was the output of a system designed to function exactly as it had functioned. The design had been implemented carefully enough that no individual signature appeared on anything explicitly stating what the system was built to do. Darnell noted all of this the way he noted things that were true and complete. Then he moved on. 6 months after the settlement, Rachel called to tell him that Healthbridge had completed its process revision and filed the required documentation with the department. He thanked her and ended the call. That evening, Evan asked how the hospital case had turned out. Darnell told him the bill was gone and that the state had required both organizations to change how they handle cases like his. Evan thought about it. Then he asked whether the question about the computer adding the code for a lot of people had mattered. Darnell told him it had. That question had led them to Maria Reyes. And Maria had been the second case that helped the department see a pattern, instead of a single complaint that could be explained away. Evan said, "Good." Then he went back to what he had been doing. Darnell packed 2 years of documentation into a cardboard box and put it in the closet, not because he wanted to forget it, because he was finished. He sat at the kitchen table with a transport contract from a new client, a regional produce distributor. The paperwork looked clean. He read to the first page of the general terms and rate structure. Then he went back to page 1 and read it again. He was looking for the place where what the contract said and what it actually meant might not be the same thing. He found a clause on page 4, a force majeure provision that inadvertently transferred delay liability to him under conditions that were actually the shipper's responsibility. He flagged it with a note and set the contract aside for the morning. He kept his pen. He had read it twice. He always would. Here's what the system counted on. That Darnell Briggs would look at a 40-page bill, feel the weight of $400,000, and eventually stop asking questions. That's not a cynical interpretation of what happened. It's the accurate one. The pattern only works when people give up. 200 people had already paid and walked away before Darnell sat down at his kitchen table with a notepad. The system wasn't unusual. The system was working exactly as designed. What Hess, Dalton, and every layer of that machine miscalculated was simple. They looked at a truck driver and decided he was someone who would accept the answer they gave him. They didn't consider that 11 years of reading freight contracts had built something in him. Not legal expertise, not connections, not money, just a habit of reading everything twice and asking why when the numbers didn't match. That's the thing about power that assumes people won't push back. It depends entirely on being right about who it's dealing with. The moment it's wrong about that, even once, the whole structure becomes visible. How you treat people when you think they can't see what you're doing is the most accurate picture of who you are, not the mission statement, not the annual report, not the language in the settlement agreement. What you do when you think no one is looking closely enough. Darnell Briggs was looking. He had been looking for 11 years. They just didn't know what kind of man they had sent that bill to. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because we're just getting started.